All right, so today we're going to be talking about manifest destiny and how the ways in which manifest destiny and other territorial expansion led to kind of conflict in the United States from 1820 to 1860. Okay, so these two dates are important here because 1820 is the Missouri Compromise when we had, Missouri being admitted to the United States as a state that allowed slavery and Maine as a state that did not allow slavery, maintaining that balance between free and slave states in America. And it was kind of a political balance. This was a compromise, not meant to solve the issue of slavery, but kind of just to push it down the road a little bit here. And so 1860, this is when Abraham Lincoln gets elected. And this is really the thing that seals the South's idea that they have no choice but to secede because they think that the United States is going to outlaw slavery. So these are the two dates that we're looking at here. And so we're looking at kind of conflicts here, military conflicts, political conflicts over slavery, and kind of ethnic conflicts, particularly in the West in these new lands, because those lands are not empty, right? There are other people there that are already there as white American settlers move west. So let's start with the military conflicts here. So there are two. One that happens between Mexico and Texas when Texas was not part of the United States, and the other is the Mexican American War. So Mexico invades Texas here. This is when General Santa Anna was in charge of, had taken control of Mexico, and he took troops to Texas, which was part of Mexico, as an attempt to control the Americans in Texas. Because what had happened, Americans had been moving from America in the South into Texas because Texas had rich soil for growing cotton. So you had these kind of Southern farmers moving west, and they were bringing slavery with them. And so, with this kind of immigration or migration of Americans into Texas, more and more of them came in, and they started to kind of take control of Texas. Mexico didn't like that. The irony here is that Mexico initially had encouraged American migration into Texas as a way to kind of settle the land, but essentially there were so many of these Americans coming in that Mexico was like, okay, that's too many. We want to limit their influence here. And so when Santa Anna brings in the troops to kind of control Texas, it fails. There's the Battle of San Jacinto and then the famous Alamo, where Americans kind of hold off the Mexican troops into a stalemate at best, I think. And what ends up happening is Texas declares its independence as an independent republic because the United States does not want Texas to join it yet because that will invite conflict with Mexico as well as conflict over the issue of slavery, and the presidents at the time like Jackson and Van Buren and Harrison don't want to deal with that. So when this military conflict is between Mexico and Texas, even though Texas is not part of the United States yet, it does involve Americans. The other one is the actual Mexican-American War. And this was kind of a war that was really kind of made to happen by President Polk. President Polk was elected in 1844, and he was an expansionist Democrat. And Democrats wanted to expand west in part to expand slavery. And so Polk basically sets this up where he sends American troops into disputed territory, so land that was claimed by both Mexico and the United States, and American soldiers end up getting killed there. And so he uses that as justification for war. And this occurs in Texas because Texas had been annexed by Polk to the United States. So Texas was now part of the United States after being independent for 9 years. In the war with Mexico, the United States military actually goes all the way down to Mexico City and kind of takes Mexico City. And the idea here was that the United States wanted to get California, New Mexico, and make sure they held on to Texas. Okay, that was kind of the whole idea here. And the result of the war is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which the United States basically gets what it wants here from Mexico. So this is a successful military conflict from the point of view of people like Polk and the Democrats. However, many people, like in the Whig Party, were opposed to this war because they felt like it was a war just to expand slavery, and they were uncomfortable with this idea. Abraham Lincoln kind of makes his first appearance on the national scene here by kind of calling out Polk and saying, hey, can you show me the spot on the map where those American soldiers were killed? because Lincoln wants to try and get to the point that this was disputed territory. It wasn't like an act of aggression of Mexico. It was land that was disputed and claimed by both countries. So it kind of muddies the water. It makes it a little bit unclear as to what was actually happening. All right, so then we have the big issue, which is slavery here. This is the big issue of this time period. So there's a lot of political conflict over slavery. Okay, Northerners, they oppose the annexation of Texas because that would mean another slave state added to the country, and they were opposed to that. Um, and then during the Mexican War, David Wilmot, who was a member of the Free Soil Party, he proposes in Congress the Wilmot Proviso, which is saying that any land that the United States gets from Mexico, so basically California and New Mexico, and other disputed lands, would not allow slavery. So kind of it puts this issue of slavery front and center on the table to let everybody know, like, hey, we think this war with Mexico is really about expanding slavery. This law does not pass, but it makes the kind of conversation happen. And that's what's important about it. And you start to have these other parties kind of developing. Some of the Whigs aren't happy with, where things are with Western expansion. Some Whigs are pro-expansion. Some are opposed to it. You have a third party like the Free Soil Party, which is opposed to the expansion of slavery in the West. And those kind of those third parties and the fragments of the Whig Party, they kind of coalesce and they become the new Republican Party. So the Republican Party kind of built its first kind of campaigns around this idea of opposing the expansion of slavery and opposing kind of westward expansion. In 1850, we have a really important law here as part of the Compromise of 1850, which we'll talk about at a different time. But one of the parts of it is the Fugitive Slave Act. And this was a very strict law that basically said that if you were a Northerner and you knew that somebody was a runaway slave, that you had the duty to report that. You were basically a part of making sure that runaway slaves were returned back to the South. And Northerners were strongly opposed to this. They felt like this was making them part of slavery, and they did not want any part of that. This was strongly opposed by abolitionists and other people in the North because they felt like they were being brought into slavery in a way that they were not comfortable with. So we have these political conflicts here that are about new political parties, expansion of slavery into the West, and about where slavery is going to happen. Okay. And then the third category is kind of ethnic conflicts in the West. And the main idea here is that, as Americans move west, they're coming across Native American groups, many different tribes. They're coming across Mexicans that were now part of the United States after the war with Mexico. And so you end up with conflicts between these white settlers that are wanting this new land and against the people that were already settled in that land. So it's important to remember that the West was not this empty place. There were people that were already there. So we have American migration into Oregon in the 1840s, and you have, this is a repeat of like the colonial era where Native Americans were dying of diseases that they had been exposed to through white settlers. And so you end up with this kind of conflict there. The Americans kind of started taking over Oregon. Also in Texas, after Texas's independence, there's a group of Mexicans in Texas called Tejanos that were kind of were helped to fight against Mexico in Texas's kind of war for its own independence. But the Americans distrusted them because they were Mexicans, spoke a different language, different culture, that kind of thing. And they sought to limit their power. They lost their land. And so Texas became this kind of white American-dominated society. And then finally, the gold rush in California in 1849 occurs. And, there are many people coming from the east to the west to look for gold. You have immigrants from China that are looking for gold, that sort of thing. And you have the exploitation of Native Americans in California, using their labor to help with mining for gold and that kind of thing. And you end up with this kind of racialized kind of class system in California, where even the Chinese immigrants that arrived into California were kind of treated as second class. And this will have greater impacts later on in the 1880s. Okay, so when we look at manifest destiny and territorial expansion, there were different kinds of conflicts, right? We have military conflicts that are actual, like aggressive military conflicts. We have kind of political ideologies over slavery and where slavery should expand to. And then we have this idea of white people moving into lands already occupied by other groups of people and the conflict that results from that.